Perhaps many of you have heard about the unique relationship between women and Passover. Of course, the story hinges on the heroism of Miriam and Yocheved, respectively Moshe's sister and his mother. The rabbis even go so far as to declare, "B'zchut nashim tzidkaniyot nigalu Yisrael," in the merit of righteous women, the children of Israel were redeemed from Egypt. Perhaps you know about the obvious connection between women and the story of Purim. That one's easy, right? The scroll, after all, is named for Esther, the most important character in that story. So far, so good. But did you know about the connection between women and Chanukah? Jewish law brings a unique law around what is usually considered to be a halachic principle, which is man grama, mitzvot, commandments that have a particular time-bound element. Nashim p'turot, women would be exempt from that, presumably in a very traditional context. Women were at home, whatever it was, there were exigencies that might make the fulfillment of the commandment that is time-bound an exemption for them. But when it comes to Chanukah, af heim ayu be'oto anes, the rabbis say no, women have the equal and completely equal obligation to men in lighting Chanukah candles. And when asked why in halachic literature, in the literature of our rabbis around Jewish law, it says because many miracles happen with women during Chanukah. When pressed further, the rabbis produced three stories. Three women's stories that are connected to the holiday. Each reflects a different aspect of Jewish tradition and women's lives. For centuries, the best known was the narrative of Hannah and her 7 sons, which, like the Maccabee saga, appears not in the Hebrew Bible, but in the Apocrypha, the works that were not included in the Bible. Hers is a familiar story in Jewish history, one of suffering and martyrdom. And she plays the familiar women's role of a strong and pious mother. In this case, her strength and piety are put to the ultimate test as the cruel Antiochus, the Seleucid king of Syria, tries to force each of her sons to eat pork. As each refuses, the son is tortured and murdered while his agonized mother looks on. The king urges Hannah to persuade her sole remaining child, the youngest one, to save his own life by eating pork, but instead she encourages him to follow his brother's example and martyr himself. Torn by grief, with her sons gone, Hannah dies. Hannah's commitment to Jewish law under the direst of circumstances encourages generations of Jews in many lands as they face pogroms and persecutions and were faced with that ultimate question of give up who they were or die. A very different Hannah appears in the second story. She takes center stage in a story that's generally told in only books of legends in Agadah. And there, this young woman in Hannah is the sister of one of the Maccabees, and she's about to be married. And determined to prevent the local Syrian ruler from exercising his droit de seigneur, the right to have sexual relations with a new bride, she strips naked before the guests at her wedding feast. And when her brothers threaten to kill her because of her shameful behavior, she demands that they save the honor of all Jewish women by fighting the Syrians. And as the tale goes, her action sparks a rebellion. This second Hannah story tells the story of a passive, fawning Jewish leadership who have been passively and quietly allowing their own sisters and mothers to be violated until Hannah's courage stirs them from their moral slumber. And then there is the story of Yehudit, of Judith. In this last narrative, Holofernes, an Assyrian general, sets out to conquer Judea, but is stopped by the people of Bethulia, possibly Jerusalem. He besieges the city, and worn down by hunger and thirst, the elders decide to surrender. And then Yehudit enters the story. The beautiful widow berates the leaders for their lack of faith and devises her own plan, taking her maid and a sack of food to eat because she observes kashrut. She talks her way into Holofernes' camp, And there she convinces the general that she deserted her people, and by praying to God, she can bring him victory. And for 3 days, she leaves in the nighttime to pray and returns in the morning, accustoming the guards to her coming and going. And on the 4th day, Holofernes gives a banquet in her honor. Overcome by lust and planning to seduce her, he dismisses his servants and then drinks himself into a stupor. Judith grabs a sword and kills Holofernes. This last story speaks not of the spiritual power to withstand assimilation and accommodation. This last story speaks not of inspiring others to take up the rebellion, but this last story speaks of this powerful, remarkable woman's ability to recognize what was needed in the moment and to be herself that example. This Chanukah, a mere 2 months after mothers like Hannah watched their children slaughtered before their eyes, and the world watched silently as Jewish women like the second Hannah were sexually violated in ways that we cannot imagine. We were witness this week to women like Yehudit, whose bravery inspired us all. 3 women, 2 of them my own nieces, and 1, the remarkable mother of a fallen Israeli soldier, delivered clear and unambiguous moral messages to fellow Jews and to the West that stood in extreme contrast to the moral confusion of 3 bastions of higher education. Those institutions, remarkably represented by 3 women, those represented were Harvard's President Claudine Gay, Penn's President Liz McGill, and MIT's President Sally Kornbluth, who, when questioned about whether calling for the genocide of Jews would violate their school's codes of conduct related to bullying and harassment, spoke about context dependency and other mealy-mouthed responses delivered with absolutely no emotion or empathy for Jewish students who feel vulnerable and exposed. My niece, Eva Ingber, is a student in narrative medicine in Columbia University, and she's also an alum of Penn. She wrote a piece in today's Forward where she described life for her now on Columbia's campus. In one of her classes, they had been discussing W.E. Sebald's award-winning fictional Holocaust novel, Austerlitz. That discussion had gone on for 3 weeks, and then they had been given guidelines for a presentation to bring art or media that thematically connected to the discussion at hand, the Holocaust. And so Eva did a presentation on clips from the film Shoah, Claude Lanzmann's 9-hour documentary about the Holocaust. The clips she showed featured harrowing testimony from Philip Muller about his unfathomable experience as a Sonderkommando, a gas chamber attendant at Auschwitz. And she, my niece, as the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, felt that that material was particularly relevant and important for the class, so she brought it to them. She brought it because she was sitting with peers who had not grown up like she had with a robust Holocaust curricula in Jewish day schools. She felt an obligation to share survivor testimonies, to share their horrors, so that others could help the world never forget. And you can imagine, she writes about her surprise when her professor, someone whom she looks up to, made their discomfort with her choice known to her and to the class. The professor announced that this might not be the right place for such disturbing material because of how hard it is to hear it and process such atrocities. She was stunned. The footage included no gore, no blood, no death, just vivid descriptions from Mueller as the camera panned over crematorium ruins in Auschwitz. How could that not be allowed in a classroom, she wrote, a place where we're supposed to teach and learn? So she met with her professor outside of class to discuss the reaction. And it turned out, she said, that their reasoning was even worse than she'd imagined. The professor told her that the material was inappropriate because of all the death and dying in Gaza. The fact that some of my classmates are out at the protests and that they don't want to make those students feel uncomfortable or unsafe in the classroom. And then they added, for better or for worse, in this particular moment, where this is a particular moment where Jewish suffering is not what people want to hear. My niece wrote, President McGill's blubbering, context-dependent answer felt rooted in the same logic as that of my professor. Both responses reflect a fear of making other people uncomfortable and a fear of not leaving enough space for all perspectives to safely dwell in an academic setting, even when those perspectives are truly genocidal. Eva's younger sister, Bella, is a junior at NYU, and she was physically assaulted by a pro-Palestinian protester in the NYU library while security guards stood by and watched. She's a tough, amazing kid, and eloquent and sharp and self-possessed and remarkable, both of them, Eva and Bella. And Bella spoke in Washington, D.C. this past week and said these powerful words flanked by congressmen and women. What is it like to be a Jew on NYU's campus, she asked. It's going to Booth's library to study and being interrupted by unauthorized protests, where students and faculty call for a globalized intifada revolution, an incitement to violence against Jews everywhere, and a call for the annihilation of the Jewish state and my friends and family who live there. Being a Jew at NYU, she wrote, is being surrounded by students and faculty who support the murder and kidnapping of Jews because, after all, as they say, resistance is justified when people are occupied. It's being surrounded by social justice warriors and self-proclaimed feminists whose calls for justice end abruptly when the rape victims are Jews. Being a Jew at NYU has meant being physically assaulted in NYU's library by a fellow student because she was wearing an American-Israeli flag and having my attacker still roam freely throughout the campus. Being a Jew at NYU is experiencing how diversity, equity, and inclusion is not a value that NYU extends to its Jewish students. She goes on to say, powerfully, today in 2023, at NYU, I hear calls to gas the Jews, and I am told that Hitler was right. She goes on to say, I am a proud Jew, and I'm a proud Zionist. I am the granddaughter of Holocaust survivors, and we are not going anywhere. Anti-Semitism and the support for terror should have no home at NYU or any other college campus. We made the promise of never again, and never again is now. We are waking up, friends, to a world that is in the throes of a collective psychosis. The writing was on the wall for years before October 7th, but it wasn't about the failures to find a solution to the problem of 1967. It was always about 1948 and Israel's right to self-determination. We in the West must be brutally honest about a basic truth. Ideologies that have a kernel of truth when touching Jews are refracted yet again by Jewish hatred. There is no ideology, no matter how brilliant, no matter how just, no matter how insightful it is, that once refracted through whether or not it applies to Jews, remains the same. This is a truth that we are waking up to. That in the aftermath of October 7th, October 8th and 9th are the most devastating for our own worldviews. When people in the world were silent and Thomas Friedman and others penned for us, don't do anything, Israel, lest you lose the sympathies of the world, because after all, the world loves dead Jews. The last woman who spoke this week and brought me to tears was the mother of a remarkable soldier named Ben Zussman, a family that moved to Israel years ago from America and became a part of the world of Jerusalem and the world of those who knew this family know that it's a remarkable family, the Zussman family. And so Ben Zussman, who was 22 years old, his mother stood up and began to talk about Yaled Chalom Hayali. I had a dream child, she said. Everybody loved him. She said that she was afraid to leave him in a room with like inanimate objects because she thought he'd become friends with all of the inanimate objects. He was so friendly and so beloved. Loved ping pong and loved Israel. And she wrote this. She wrote, "We will prevail. We don't have any other option. We are a people that values life, not like our vile and wretched enemy, cowards, Nazis and their allies who sanctify death. We will live. We will prosper and we will build, and our leaders must be worthy of us," she said, "of the Israeli spirit that pulsates within each and every one of us, of the Israeli spirit that pulsates within our amazing chayalim, our amazing soldiers." There was a Rebbe that many of you know I've spoken about in this shul many, many times before. His name was Rav Klonomas Kalman Shapira. He was the Rebbe of the Warsaw Ghetto, and before the war, he was a Rebbe in Piazetzner. And we have a living testimonial of what it was like for him to try to be a rabbi in the Warsaw Ghetto during the most unimaginably brutal time. And in 1940, on this Shabbat, the Shabbat of Parshat Vayeshev, he gave a sermon that I taught this week in my Chassidut class. The Rebbe began by talking about silence, that there is a silence, he says, that is so exalted. It's a silence where there is so many words to say, but we can't find the right word because the words feel that they would limit the beauty and the transcendence and the sublimity that we've seen. That's a type of silence called charisha or cheresh. Azor lashovtim bayom hashvi becharish. Give help to those who on Shabbat are silent because of the beauty of Shabbat. They can't find the words. And then the Rebbe went on to say that there's a different kind of silence called ilmut, aleph lamed mem. Aleph lamed mem. He said that silence is not a silence of presence where we have too many feelings to fit into language, but a silence that is born of the inability to even find language. And he said here in the Warsaw Ghetto, when day after day we're experiencing ilmut, right? We can't speak, we can't believe it. He said, after so many moments of disbelief, one decides to become silent, not because one couldn't find the words, but one doesn't believe they matter. One doesn't believe that language matters in that moment. And then he said, and he pointed to this week's Torah portion. In the dream of Yosef, in the dream of Joseph, Joseph talks about sheaves of wheat. Remember that, everybody? He comes to the brothers and says, we have sheaves of wheat. Hinei anachnu almim alumim. We are almim alumim. We are making sheaves. And the word in Hebrew for sheave is also the same word as elaim, to be mute. They're exactly the same word, but they're not from the same root. And he says, allegorically, Joseph came to the brothers and he said, behold, we are finding ourselves without language. Hinei anachnu almim alumim. We have become mute. We're afraid, especially, I find it a bit funny when rabbis in the liberal world talk about how hard it is to talk in critique of Israel. I find the opposite experience to be true, that speaking in support of Israel in liberal circles feels to me dangerous. Speaking in support of Israel makes me want to sometimes not speak. And so the Rebbe said, Hinei anachnu almim alumim. Behold, we are sheaving sheaves. We're muted. We don't have language. But then Joseph says, but my sheaves stood up. My sheaves stood up. And then in the dream, what happens? Now, and then all of your sheaves stood up. And so the Rebbe wrote these words, V'nei kama alumati v'gam nitzava. Behold, my sheave, my mutedness arose. Mikodem kvar ratziti lahatot shechmi v'lichyos chay ilmus. Says, I was thinking I'm going to go back to sleep because language doesn't matter. It doesn't matter, right, to hear the story of Chana and Yehudit and of Eva and Bella and Sarit. We're just going to be quiet. אבל כשמעלמים עלומים אז לא יכולתי כבר לסבול את האלימות, ונתחזקתי לצעוק יותר. But when I saw that the silence was becoming so painful, I decided I would arouse myself and scream out and break the ilmut. These three women, in such a profound way, represent not only the search for that pure, undefiled oil, but a willingness to light that candle, to light that menorah, to put it in the window and say, we won't be silent. We won't be silent as heads of universities that impact thousands and thousands of people say in full view, in public, that they can't answer the question, is calling for the genocide of Jews a violation of your harassment policy? I'm not sure. It depends. Legalese. There might be lawsuits. No, please, just a really clear answer. To live in a world where we are being accused of genocide and those who are calling for genocide are not called out. It's crazy making. I can't tell you how much pride I had seeing my niece standing there and speaking on behalf of the great-great-grandfather she never met, whom I was named for, who perished in Tarnów, Poland. And it all began with people being able to say, oh, it's context dependent. It's context dependent. Professors saying to my niece in Columbia University, oh, the Holocaust? We don't have any space now for Jewish suffering. And not to mention, I'll just be really clear here, and then we're coming in for a landing. Not to mention how often I get emails from people, and I think to myself, emails from people asking me to say things in the shul that they need to hear in order to feel like they can come to the shul. And I think to myself, when I get those emails, I first feel, wow, okay, we have such a humane, beautifully universal community. Love you. And then I ask myself, have I ever received emails from people when I neglect to mention various Jewish communities here in New York that have been targeted by hate crimes? Like, does anybody in our community write me an email at the end of a Shabbat and say, I can't believe you forgot to mention the Hasidim in Borough Park that were attacked last week? What kind of Jew are you? What kind of Jew stands up in front of 150, 200, 300 Jews and doesn't mention brothers and sisters who are being harmed? I've never received an email in 17 years like that, not once. I promise you. Can scour my emails for it. And I think to myself, wow, that's remarkable. A small community as small as that little jar of oil that in spite of everything over the last couple thousand years was able to make it. We thought we'd make it 10 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, and here we are, strong. We celebrate the light of the menorah, and we celebrate the spiritual audacity of these women. But also tonight we celebrate Yehudit and her power. I was in Israel 2 weeks ago, and I was sitting with a friend who's just the most amazing academic of Jewish mysticism, and she's involved in every peace organization in Israel, the ones that I was involved with, and still am. And she was sitting with us, a group of 40 rabbis, and she started to be really honest, talking about her experience of the last 2 months. And at one point, she kicked back in the chair, and she said the four-letter word that begins with F, out loud, really loud. And she said, we have an army, thank God. I shudder to think of a world where Jews don't recognize that we need both spiritual power and military might in order to defend ourselves and make sure that we are also not on the way to hearing louder and louder in the streets of New York and London and Paris and all of the other extremely sophisticated cultural centers of our world, death to the Jews, Hitler was right. I shudder to think of a world that I wasn't born into with the privilege I have to be able to know that Ben Zussman gave his life so that I could live on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. I shudder to think of a world like that. Af hein hayu be'oto nes. Those women showed us the way. For all of our mothers and our sisters and our daughters and our nieces and our granddaughters, may God give us the strength. Give us the strength to be proud of being Jewish. Give us the strength to know who our enemies are and to not be pacifists at this crucial moment. May God give us the strength that at the appropriate moments to soften our hearts, to imagine a world where these energies will one day be completely absorbed into a world where peace, love, justice, equality reign supreme, and where we Jews can close our eyes and dream together of a time where everyone is seen as the child of God that they are. May that day come soon, and may we help bring it. Please rise.